Well, looking to the left, looking to the right, making sure they're not being followed. Good. Welcome to Nikos RPG. I'm the Game Master, and we are going to be doing some Game Master's stories. I've got a few. I've been GMing for 50 years, pretty much nonstop, and I have stories dating back from when I was 11, when I was 17, when I was 25, when my son was 7, when he was 25, and so on. And I just want to share a few of them in this format, and if you really like what we have to talk about and you want to hear more, make sure you let me know. Before we get started, make sure you go down below and press all the buttons so that the algorithm knows that you're part of our audience. And let's get started, okay?
Absorbing damage is the name of the game.
Alrighty, so before I start telling my 16th level paladin stories, I want to tell you the story of the 16th level paladin. And this is an ongoing inside joke for people that are in the games industry. Everybody knows about the 16th level paladin, and if you're ever offered the opportunity, kindly refrain from saying yes and walk away passively. All right, the idea is this. You are at a games event and you are somewhat of a known personality, so people are very interested in getting an opportunity to speak with you. Since you are currently tied to the space, your booth or your table or your signing line or whatever at the event, and you are therefore sequestered. You can't go anywhere. So along comes an individual, young, enthusiastic, has been playing the game for maybe 7 months, really excited about what's going on. And as he starts to talk with you, he asks if you want to hear about his 16th level paladin. Now the character space, race, class can change from story to story, but the idea is basically the same. He's going to regale you with not only the gist of the primary reason why he brought it up to you, but he's going to regale you with all of the extreme details of how the paladin originally determined to leave his home and what his backstory was, and it just becomes this monstrosity of a tale. So I'm providing you with some snippets from my past, and I'm hoping that they won't become for you the 16th level paladin stories. Now, some of these I have related in part or in whole at other times, so if you've heard one of these, you can just move on to the next. I'll make sure to put a schedule of them, of the names of them, in the description after I get this published. But the idea is that each of these stories is something that actually happened in a role-play game of which I was an experienced person. Either I was the player, or I was involved with the group, or I was the game master for all of these stories. And I think that one of the reasons why the 16th level paladin trope is out there is that there are enough of us that have played role-playing games that really do want to share what happened in the last game, or what we were excited about, what brought us to the hobby, and what's keeping us still here. So I want to make sure that I provide enough information to make the stories enjoyable and not go over the top. So again, if you see something that I'm doing with the presentation, make sure you let me know in the comments below so I can make whatever adjustments I need to make these stories more palatable, more enjoyable, and not end up with you feeling that I'm the guy with the 16th level paladin. Let's get started. Alrighty, so beginning at the beginning, I started playing when I was 11, and I was a member at that time, arguably in good standing because I'd paid my dues and everything for this club that I was a part of, and I know you're going to chuckle at the name. It was called the Mile High Club, Mile High Gamers Club, and it was in Aurora, Colorado, and it was mile high because of being in Denver, which has an elevation of 5,280 feet, which is a mile. But the joke, of course, went way over my head at the age of 11. But our games group got together every week on the weekend, early on Saturday morning when the library opened, and we would get to our appointed place and play. And many of the games that we played were historic war games. In the 1970s, that was the rage. whether you were playing the Battle of Tobruk or if you were battling across the deserts of North Africa or deep in the Ardennes, you were engaging in war fighting through tabletop tokens and also miniatures games. As a matter of fact, that in particular weekend, we were slated to be playing one of my favorites at the time, which was called Mustangs and Messerschmitts. And yes, if that name sounds like a ripoff of Dungeons and Dragons, it's sort of in reverse. Mustangs and Messerschmitts was a miniatures game predicated on utilizing 1/72nd scale model aircraft and fighting air duels over the battlefields of World War II using these scale models, and parameter sheets were created for each craft so you knew how fast it could move, how fast it could climb, or whatever. And we would literally use these models on sticks. I'll go into that in a different story about the M&M, but the idea is that you would stick the models on wooden wheels and they would chase each other around. It's a fun story. Anyway, we were supposed to be playing M&M that day, and unfortunately it was a snowy day in late autumn, heading toward, school already started again, and so it was a bad weather day, and so the person who actually had the majority of the models, the guy who had spent all of his years in youth making and building all of these models, was unable to come. And since the majority of the models and the bases and all of the rules were under his control and his ownership, we weren't going to be able to play that. So my buddy says, well, my grandpa's in town and he's got a game him and his friends are making, and can we play that instead? And the group said, sure, why not? We're open to try new things. And as it happened, my buddy's grandpa Dave was Dave Arneson. And so we got a chance to play this game. It was, I don't even believe it was published yet. It may have been. I was young enough at the time that I can't claim all of the details were clear in my brain, but I know that we were working off of predominantly typed up pages and mimeograph pages of a document that the person who was going to be the game master brought with him. And so we were all given the information to build a character. We actually built it on, I remember we built it on regular paper, writing out all of the attributes and the skills, and even building the fundamental character sheet look on our regular piece of paper. And as we went through this process, me being 11 years old, I do have to give a caveat, and it's probably going to be a precursor, but the books that I was reading at that time happened to be, I had just finished The Hobbit and was starting into The Lord of the Rings. And so when they described the different personas, of course, an 11-year-old kid who already sees himself in that smaller size, I piped up and immediately said, well, I'm going to play, my character is going to be one of these Hobbit things. And of course, when it came to the naming convention, I was so unimaginative at that time and so enthralled with the character, which I had also just recently seen in the Don Bluth film, that I would be Bilbo. So I was Bilbo Baggins. And so that's why I called this episode My Dirty Little Secrets, because I rail and regale everyone about how they should play in homebrews and play in non-aligned environments, because then it's under the control and purview of the game master and he can make it his own. And the story certainly was, but of course I had that character name. And in the modern era, if you talk with me in a place other than this private place that's only here between you, me, and the potential millions of people that might one day see it, the very idea of the name of the character now is called the Emissary. So if I ever refer in modern era to the first characters in the world of Nikos, the first persons that I developed, they were he was known as the Emissary, or is known as the Emissary now. But so the story of the first game, which is really what I wanted to talk about, is that the game master was describing in vivid detail We didn't have any miniatures. We didn't have any artwork. We didn't have any pictures. We just were basing it solely on the words that were falling from the game master's lips. And this is where I developed my real appreciation for the concept of theater of the mind roleplay and why my environment still stays fundamentally there. But his storytelling was amazing. We were assaulted by animated skeletons. We fought off a bunch of giant spiders. But the reason why I tell the story is specifically the last encounter that I remember, and that was we had already made our way out of the dungeon. We were carrying our loot back to town, and the game master started to describe this last encounter. Now, for clarity and specificity, the world we lived in the 1970s was a world of the me generation, the idea of there were still hippies that were walking the streets. There were people that were of the beatnik generation. And one of the things that was available quite readily at just about every gas station were these pop-up balls. I'm sure you've seen them. They're even still around today. These little spheres with a treasure inside, and you put a coin in the machine and you turned it, and this little sphere dropped out, and there'd be a toy or a trinket or something inside. Well, at this point in time, one of the most popular of these items was a sticker. And it wasn't just a standard sticker. It was fundamentally what you might consider today to be a 3D sticker, because it was actually a printed image that looked like the bottom of a human foot with no shoe on. So it was the main body of the foot plus the toes. And it was made out of fake fur. And I'm talking the nylon as fake can be, fur in a wider range of colors. So, for example, the background of the item might be yellow neon, but then there would be this chunk of fur attached to the sticker so that you could place it on a surface and therefore have that footprint. And that was not intentionally, but de facto a symbol of the hippie generation and freeness and liberty and independence. And so when you would place these wherever, these little footprint things were ubiquitous. They were everywhere. People posted them on the side of mailboxes, which would, of course, then be removed. Or they'd put it on the side of a bathroom toilet or a toilet door, or they'd put it on the bus stop. They were everywhere. And so I tell all of that story, as my grandfather would say, to tell you this. In this game, the game master was finally describing that on our way back, when we had camped for that last evening before we returned to our village, the local cut purses and foot pads attacked. Well, as you may know, a cut purse and a foot pad are names for the class levels in Dungeons and Dragons. And so a cut purse was the lowest level, and then the next up was the foot pad. And of course, not knowing that, in my 11-year-old brain, I'm seeing these footprints. And they were described. Now, the reason why I felt this way is that they were described in the following fashion. The foot pads are approaching from the trail that you just come down from the adventure. They've been following you silently for some time and tracking each of your steps. As they approach your encampment, they move to attack, and they will be going for attacks against your throat. So they are going to be going for the jugular. So in my 11-year-old brain, I'm seeing these little disembodied footprints, furry, sneaking up on us through the darkness. And of course, I'm agitated and worried they're going to get us. And there was a big pitched fight, and we ended up, defeating them. But here's the rest of the story. I didn't know about that. I didn't know that that's what they were until I was able to buy the player's handbook, which I think was like 3 years into my actual expertise as player and game master. I didn't have any books. I didn't have any materials. I had no framework for knowing what a cut purse or a footpad was. But I knew what these footprint stickers looked like. And so they became in my head what these were. And so in the world of Nikos, even from the very first, my monsters were creative and misinterpretations of that which was given to us. And so now you've heard the story of my first game of D&D. There's a lot more to it, and I'm sure I will embellish at later points. But that is, as Forrest Gump would say, all I want to say about that. Okay, so when you talk about being a game master and a dungeon master, one of the first things that you do by nature is start drawing out your maps as a fundamental maze on graph paper. And of course, to get graph paper, you have to go to a place where there are engineering supplies, at least back in the 70s. It wasn't something you just didn't find graph paper at your local Five and Dime. You had to go someplace special. So I convinced my mom to take me to a place where there was I think it was a drafting and stencils company. They did some printing as well. But that's where I got my first graph paper. And one of the things about that drawing process is that you're, as a young mind, especially as young as I was, you were drawing the maps simply as fundamentally one block mazes and winding the pathways left and right, putting markers to indicate the doors. An S on a door would indicate that it was a secret door. A C on the door would consider it was concealed, and if it was a T, it was probably thought of as a window. No, I'm kidding. The T would, of course, mean trapped. Suffice it to say, I would draw these maps in my copious free time. As a student, I was always precocious and way ahead and had all my homework done all the time, and I was kind of an annoyance to all the other members in my class. But I would work on these maps morning, noon, and night whenever I had a moment. And so by the time I was 12 or 13, I had literally dozens of these maps drawn out. Now, a part of my life that you most certainly aren't aware of is that I moved extensively. I moved 40 times before I was 18. I went to 22 different grade schools and 6 different high schools across 11 different states. And in all of those travels, I was always the new kid, but I was also the new game master. And so I usually had a pretty full table. As soon as I was comfortable enough, which only take me 2 or 3 weeks, I'd be ready to start running again. And so I would add new players, and away we would go. So this was going to be the first time that I was in a mixed class. There was going to be 7th, 8th, and 9th graders in this school. It was the first time that I had been to what now is considered a middle school, what they called when I was there a junior high school. And so junior high school, I'm a first year, equivalent of a freshman, and the oldest kids are 2 years older than me. Well, they had been playing role-play games for a while, but they recognized me as a new game master and fundamentally as a fish. And so they stepped into the game, and the first thing they asked was, how thick are the walls? Well, I hadn't considered that. I drew the maps, and I knew each square was 5 feet, and the thickness of a pencil stroke isn't very much of that space. So without really thinking about it, I said, I don't know, maybe 4 inches, 6 inches. I didn't know, and I really didn't want to show myself off as not knowing. So I made a statement. Well, these kids were pre-high school and had already gotten, an idea of what they were going to do ahead, and so they had already taken some rudimentary drafting courses, and so they knew that structurally, if a wall was only 4 inches, then a qualified dwarf with any mining experience would be able to cut through that in no time at all. And so we dithered for a little bit at the very beginning, talking about what that would be like. And of course, I wasn't really paying attention. I was just excited to get them into the story. And I had planned it out. I had basically almost every single box on the 8.5 by 11 sheet at 1/4 inch boxes completely filled in with rooms and encounters and descriptions of the different traps and method. As soon as they walked in the door, they said, "Well, this guy's he's playing a dwarf, and I'm playing a dwarf, and that person's got really good strength. So what we're going to do is we're just going to start. We're going to pick a direction. They did ask for some description of the type of locale, and they had done some quick calculations and said, okay, we're cutting through the walls. And so even though I had the entire map mapped out for them to turn left, turn right, door, staircase, whatever, they were having none of it. They just started cutting through the walls and calculated how much time it would take, and they would encounter a monster if they happened to break into a space where there was one. But because they made this like a labyrinth, they were pretty much cutting right through all of the hallways. And when I was done with that adventure, when they finally finished, they had literally cut their way through to the center to get the big room, fought the big monster, took the treasure, and left all of that undiscovered country, so to speak, on the paper. And that was my first lesson in dealing with game players that were fundamentally playing it as a game. They were not playing it as a story element. They weren't playing it to hear the cool monsters or to have to work through the trivialities of the puzzles I was developing. They just wanted to grab the loot and go and earn the experience points by the monsters that they killed. So I learned a lot in that encounter, and after that, trust me, my walls were never 4 inches thick again. Okay, so if you're not familiar, the first Advanced Dungeons and Dragons rulebook included a couple of specialty classes that were not intended for the average player to use, but were there for the game master to possibly play on in a long-term campaign. The first of these was the monk, which was initially set up to be an Asian-rooted monk. And the other was to be the bard, which was basically built upon the culture of the northern countries of Europe. The idea that a person would become a skald and would sing the praises and the knowledges and the histories of his clan and all of that. And so therefore, both of those classes were isolated, along with, I think, the assassin. These were not put in the regular list of the character options, but they were still nonetheless listed as to make the property complete and to give a leg up to more sophisticated storytellers. Well, when you are a young game master and you've got 2 or 3 other good game masters around you, you all would like to lay claim to having a persona actually make it through all of the trials and the difficulties and become an actual bard. Well, let me introduce you to Bartholomew. My minstrel, Bartholomew, was going to follow all of those rules, and there were 3 of us game masters, myself and Danny and Mike, and the 3 of us were going to be the storyteller for the other 2 minstrels, and so they could rotate around, and so everybody would get a chance to game master, and everybody's bard wannabes would all be able to advance. And there's a problem with that, because once you get to moderate to high levels, then there are only a certain number of musical instruments available to those high level minstrels. You have to finish a college, get a book, get an instrument, play it for a while, get to the next college, get another instrument, and so on. And each one of us, myself, Danny, and Michael, we're all 3 trying to get our individual bards to that highest level, and we turned it into a competition. This was when I first realized that Dungeons and Dragons wasn't meant to be played as a competitive game, because your ego as a persona in the story gets tied to the success, welfare, and well-being of that persona, so that when the character faces a trial or a tribulation, you're the one who feels it. And as it would turn out, I would miss the opportunity to become a bard, to become the first bard, merely because the other game master, Danny in particular, had discovered one of the less well-known rules of Dungeons and Dragons, back then at least, was that when you are completely surrounded, there is theoretically no maximum number of persona that can still hit you, because of the concept of reach. And this was not given a term yet, it wasn't yet fully fleshed out, but I ended up having to deal with 100 orcs all at the same time, whereas my adventures always tried to keep it so that it would be sensible, so that left front, right front, and rear was pretty much all you could endure and deal with at any given time. And therefore, my facing 100 orcs at the same time compared to each one of them facing 100 orcs. Now, I'm using orc for the monster. I believe they're probably ogres or something much more tough by this point. But the point I'm trying to make is that I was overwhelmed by the enemy and knocked to the ground, and therefore my persona didn't get to advance through the final bit of the story, but the other two did. And so this battle of the bands, not battle of the bards, made me realize that when we are talking about role play, there is a modicum of some form of reality or realism that we want to include in the game, in order to make it equitable to all persons in the game, which may or may not be the case if your GM hasn't yet gotten to that level of a discernment. Okay. So, early-ish in my role-play experience, I was maybe 5 or 6 years in, when a certain Dallas Egbert, I think his name was, in Texas, got into a bit of a kerfuffle and started the first... Well, he was basically the first puzzle piece in the original Satanic Panic of the role-play game environment. This young man, having a lot of issues and whatever, got involved with the role-playing group. They gave him an opportunity to explore the campus of the university he was going to in a different kind of a way, and got into some shenanigans that ended up in his death. I'm not going to go into all the details. There's plenty of books out on the subject and whatever. But from that point, throughout the time that I've been a storyteller and game master, I've had to deal with the outcroppings of this Satanic Panic whenever they would arise. So I had players that couldn't play anymore because their parents didn't approve, or their grandparents had warned them away, or whatever. And so it got to the point, though, when I was 14, 15, 16, I was still an attending member of a religious organization, a Christian church, and playing role-play games. And after a while, it became problematic to do so without having to come to grips with that, with at least the faith community of which I was a part. Because if they were not aware that I was a game player and they found out, then they would be trying to push for me to stop playing or running. And so in order to preemptively deal with that, I took up courses in the subject of apologetics, which has to do with being able to defend your faith through book, chapter, verse, and such. But I was actually taking a slightly different cant, because I was also at the same time building my knowledge of what Scripture said about things like role-play. Now, there is in my repertoire an actual video on the Satanic Panic, so I would recommend that you take a look through all of my videos because I'm not going to go into all the details. But the point here I'm trying to make is that when you are providing someone with a position, you have to realize that they will use that information in whatever way suits them. And so by developing a pretty strong understanding of Christian apologetics, I was also able to build an extremely solid argumentation for allowing role-play games and, as a matter of fact, promoting role-play as a methodology for reaching people for Christianity. And without that being the one to toot horns, I will say that there have been several dozens of people who have come to a better understanding of their walk with God by playing role-playing games at my tables, because the ethics and the messages, and as you've probably heard, my ESC Timmies, really help to build up a person's faith as well as their game cred, so to speak, at the same time, by being able to hold a faith in one set of descriptive argumentation and your a proof of your gaming credentials in another. So we'll talk about that later in another video, perhaps. If you want to know more, make sure you ask in the comments below, and I'll be glad to tell you more about my faith community and my personal position on a lot of this stuff. I don't tend to make it public knowledge. All right, so players come to the game for a lot of different reasons and in a lot of different ways, and there are some that are very circumspect about what they're doing there, what they're trying to do. Some of them are very earnest in wanting to pursue the story and take copious notes and everything. And there are others that sincerely just come for the fun of it and hope to find ways to be as wacky and silly as possible, because that's what they personally get a thrill out of. So I'm going to tell you a story about Davey. Davey was a younger player. By this time, I was in the military for several decades, or several dozen years anyway. And this youngster came to the table. And what I found fascinating is that he was absolutely and unapologetically what you would, in modern terms, consider to be a murderer hobo, or conversely, a YOLO player. He wasn't yet the time of Leroy Jenkins. That term hadn't even developed yet. But the idea was that Davey would show up with a character sheet all filled out, ready to go, in keeping with where the story was going. But at some point, usually within the first hour or so, he would get a burr in his bonnet, a bee in his bonnet, and decide that he's going to do something absolutely crazy. Well, generally those crazy things end up with a character crippled, lost, or dead, and in this case he would actually have a rubber stamp in his collection of items. His notebook he called his golf clubs, because in the binder he would not only have the one adventure character that he had built specifically for this story, but he had 4 or 5 other standby characters ready to go should the first one meet its demise. He acknowledged, he knew that what he was doing was putting himself at risk throughout the games, and didn't care. He just wanted to try different things. And so, for example, his the character in his binder that was a first level ranger, he called his 1-wood. Then he had a 3-iron. And so on. And the idea was that the one that he was playing primarily was his driver character, but once that character had met its end, then he'd be ready to sub in a different one and continue playing the course, so to speak. And what I found really fascinating about him was that he understood the concept of character death far better than most, because he actually carried with him a rubber stamp that said the word dead, and then left space for the game master to put the date and the time of the character's demise, so that he would never play that character in your games again. Now, he had so many characters because he had so many game masters, and he didn't mind rotating out, so he literally had with him in that binder between 6 and 10 characters ready to go at any given time. And I don't think he ever ran out. I don't think there was ever a time where he literally had to sit on his hands because he didn't have a character to play. But that concept of playing that way, absolutely healthy, critically damaging to a campaign if the campaign has a deep story and he is the only driver. But as it was, he had a great time, and I'll never forget Davey and his golf clubs. Okie dokie, this story always gets me. So, characters in roleplay games often find themselves in situations that are challenging and competitive and all around a great situation. At any rate, in this case, a group of adventurers had decided they were going to go out and go fishing in one of the lakes of Nikos. And so they went to the local boat dispensary, a place where they had boats for rent. And they rented a boat for the afternoon to go out and do some fishing. And, of course, as a game master will do, as you do, created a pretty neat little wandering monster equivalent list for what you would attempt to catch when you went fishing. Well, they were out there for a couple of hours, and we had rolled up several different fish landing challenges that they had to work out, and they were having a great time. And one of them said to the other, says, "We need to find a way to mark this spot. This has been a really great adventure, and we don't want to lose where this is." So the other one looked at his character sheet and says, "Well, I've got a knife, and I'll go ahead and mark our location." The other guy said, "Sure, no problem." At which time he took the knife and he put a big X on the side of the boat, just behind the gunnels, and just put a big X on the side of the boat. And I was kind of surprised. I didn't expect them to deface rented property. But the other guy got really upset. He says, "What do you think you're doing?" He says, "How do you know we're going to get the same boat next time?" All right. I'll stop now. On to the next story. Okay, this story is rather developed. I'm not going to go into all of this, and I have mentioned it before, but the idea here, the setup is this. An adventuring group has a sizable complement. There are, I think, 12 or 14 players at this time. So the majority of them, 8 or 9 of them, are veterans, and they are really big on spectacle, and they see a great conflict. They wish to attack a group of Boglin that are holding a wheel, basically a miller's wheel on a riverbank, and they want to stop these infernal monsters, these Boglin, from continuing to use the wheel for their nefarious purposes, and they want to rescue the family of the millers inside. And so they determined that they should go first and leave the more vulnerable second-rank characters, the newer players, to their own devices. But they did leave one of their roguely individuals behind as the signal watcher, and he was supposed to watch for the sign when the adventurers had secured the wheel. They would stop it, and then while the wheel was stopped, the novice was supposed to bring the rest of the veterans, bring the rest of the adventurers, the rest of the newbies, across that now stopped wheel and enter the facility from the backside. It was a perfect plan, except that they left the roguely person that they left, really didn't pay attention. He wasn't listening to the message. So as adventurers sallied forth and engaged the enemy and drove them back towards the wheelhouse, got inside and put a kibosh to the operation and shut down the wheel, the party members then gave their high sign signal to their ally, who was with the new folk on the other side. Well, all of the other folk on the other side were waiting for word on what was supposed to happen because they weren't fully up on the plan. So they all turned to the veteran among their numbers, this one rogue, and they asked him, "Okay, so what was the message that you were told about what we were supposed to do?" And he couldn't remember. So what he could remember, he did blurt out, and that was, "We need to get the men off the wheel." It was supposed to be get the men across the wheel, but somehow he's missed that. And so they sat there in wonder as the Boglin rallied, started to push back, and the adventurers had to withdraw and find another way across the river, and therefore they lost the mill house. But the point of the get the men off the wheel was such a seminal arrow point at one of the biggest challenges of large groups is communication, that for decades afterwards, getting the men off the wheel was the absolutely most commonly mentioned action in all of the game sessions I ran for that period of time, that iteration. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about bluff and bluster and what characters can and can't do, and what works in a yes and universe that may not in any other way. I had just joined a group. I had moved to a new town, wasn't yet ready to be the game master again, and so I had taken up the role of a rogue. Now, the game master had put on me a bit of an onus, because he knew I was a veteran player, that I was supposed to not get caught as the rogue. As a matter of fact, he suggested that the party of adventurers would turn me in should they discover my nefarious past. And so as we entered the particular facility, it was a lab of a mad scientist, I determined that the best thing to do was to completely obfuscate my role as a rogue, downplaying those skills and instead claiming to be an alchemist. Now, that's all well and good. You go into the adventure, you're going into a room, and the game master starts to describe what obviously is a candle making process. He's describing the wicks and the tallow mixture that's still soft boiling on the fire and all of this. But the players I convinced them that I was a soothsayer, a fortune teller. And so they asked me to predict what would happen in this room. So I did some cursory checks on some items, found out that the right next to the cauldron was a box of foaming cleanser powder, and that there was several bars of soap right there next to this cauldron that was boiling with what he described as some form of paraffin or wax. So I quickly poured the powder onto the surface, as well as I think a couple of my water skins and whatever, but I caused it to become a frothing, boiling mess. Now the wax from within was, of course, boiling across the surface and hardening as it went, and the froth was beginning to boil out of the pot. So I proclaimed that there was a monster in the pot and that we needed to escape. So the adventurers began to hightail it out of there, but of course they were hightailing it because they were afraid of this horrible monster, which I knew to just be the overflowing froth of soapy mess that I was making in the cauldron. So I was able to basically do what any other rogue would normally do, which is loot the room, search out all of the treasures, while claiming to be fighting the monster and throwing things around and making a general nuisance of myself, making lots of noise and whatever. And when we finished that adventure, the game master asked me to please become a storyteller, because he didn't want me ruining any more of his adventures. So there you go. The reason why I got onto this pathway was because I'm incorrigible in any other role. All right. As is said in Shakespeare, there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamed of in your philosophy. And my point in having this series of stories was to let you know that whether you've got a great 16th level paladin and a lot of singular stories that are associated with that one individual, or you have 96 characters and a golf set like Davey, there are a lot of different ways that role-playing games can go. I hope I've given you a little bit of a flavor for what might be found at your local RPG table. If you don't have a table, I recommend you find one. I have a lot of videos here that can help you develop an understanding of role-playing games. I've got an entire playlist on how to utilize the Nikos RPG mechanisms to build out your character and become the adventuring person you want to be. And more than that, I also have great connections with game stores. If you have a game store that is not currently running or has access to Nikos RPG, make sure you give them the link to one of these videos so I can get the properties to them. I do use Keystone pricing for retailers, so it's real easy to add them, and we can get the property into your store's hands right away. I want to thank you for being here and ask you please to give me your take. What happens in adventures in your world? This would be a place where the stories of your 16th level paladin would highly be appreciated. I'd love to hear from you and have conversations about that. Until the next time, make sure that you do what my grandfather said and go play. I really need you to go play. But until then, we'll see you next time.